Hello dear viewers, my name is Dr. Mohmad Pandit, Assistant Professor at the English Department, Institute of Aeronautical Engineering, Hyderabad. Today in this video lecture, we will discuss about number 1, what's listening, what is the listening process, what are the different stages of listening, and how listening is different from hearing. And at the end, we will take different barriers of listening. First, we will start with listening. What scholars say about listening. Our first one is, it's given by Stephen R. Covey. He says, the biggest communication problem is we do not listen to understand. We listen to reply. This is the common fallacy in listening process. We often listen with a singular purpose to reply. But the fact is that we should listen in order to understand people. We always listen in order to give a reply, which is considered as great fallacy. Therefore, one needs to listen in order to understand people. That's why Stephen says the biggest communication problem is we do not listen to understand. We listen to reply. In this way, when we listen with a singular purpose to reply, naturally there occurs a communication gap between the sender and the receiver. The cycle of communication doesn't fulfill, doesn't takes its logical end. Therefore, while listening, one need to keep calm, one need to keep quiet, one need to take each and every sound signal as pronounced by the speaker so that the receiver can understand the speaker, and there must develop a coordination between the sender and the speaker. That's why we should listen in order to understand people, so that the cycle of communication will be completed. Now the second one is, listening is an art that requires attention over talent, separate over ego, others over self. It's given by Dean Jackson. Now, again, the first part of the definition is, listening is an art. That means it is something which doesn't occur all of a sudden. It is something which we learned. That's why we call it art. For example, we learn cycling, we learn boating. In a similar fashion, we learn listening. It's an art. And this art, it requires attention or talent. The most prerequisite thing in the listening process is that we must be attentive. We must be attentive to the speaker's words so that we can get each and every utterance of the speaker. We must be attentive. And this attention, it has been given priority over talent. Why? Because the listener need to be attentive to the words of the speaker. If he or she wants to understand the speaker, or if she or he wants to complete the cycle of communication. Therefore, attention or talent. Yes, talent is important. We can't negate talent because at the end of the day, it is the individual's talent who deciphers, who decodes every sound signal pronounced by the speaker. But the attention is more important than talent. If you are not attentive to the speaker's words, naturally you will not understand the speaker, and ultimately there will be a communication gap between you and the speaker. And the second one is separate or eager. A listener should not be egoistic, self-centered. He should not close himself or herself in a shell. In fact, he should expose to himself to the words of the speaker. Therefore, that's why the author says that separate ego. Separate is more important than ego. One must be very energetic while listening. One must expose himself or herself to the speaker's words. One should negate self. That's why it's often said that listening, it's a process, it's a selfless process without leaving the self. That means while listening, one need to be selfless. One should not be egoistic. One should receive sound signals or the speaker's words in a holistic manner. And the next one is others or self. Again, in the listening process, it is others who are important, not you. Don't bound yourself in a nutshell. Don't, in fact, expose yourself to others. That means the speaker's words. That's why others are important, more important than you. You should give importance to the speaker's words, or for that matter to the speaker, so that you can understand his or her message in order to give feedback. The next one, it's given by Alfred Brandon. The word listen contains the same letters as the word silent. Now, the word listening, it contains the same letters, the word listen, it contains the same words as we have in the word silent, which means that while listening, one needs to be silent. One needs to remain calm and quiet. One needs to receive each and every utterance as propounded or pronounced by the speaker. That's why we often call it a receptive signal. Because here we receive the sound signals or the speaker's words in order to understand them and then give a suitable feedback. That's why the word listen, it contains same letter as silent, which means while listening, one need to be silent, one need to be calm, one need to be attentive to the speaker's words. Then the next one is it's given by Krishna Tip. Listening is about being present, not just about being quiet. But when I say the silent, don't take a word silent for quiet. Why? Because when a person, as a listener, receives sound signals from the speaker, he or she need to be quiet. He or she need to be silent. Why? Because uh, the listener is supposed to listen each and every word of the speaker. And the next one, listening is about being present. That means while listening, one need to be present. Present means one need to be attentive, one need to be conscious. One need to be both physically as well as psychologically present. And not just being quiet. It doesn't mean that person who's a listener need to be quiet. He need to be both present, but at the same time, he or she needs to receive each sound signal as pronounced by the speaker, and thereafter he or she needs to decipher, decode those sound signals so as to understand the message. And after understanding the message, he or she, as a listener, have to give a suitable feedback. That's why one need to be very attentive, one need to be cautious, one need to be very alert while listening. The next one is it's given by Ralph Nichols. The most basic of all human needs is to understand and be understood. The best way to understand people is to listen to them. The most basic of all human needs is to understand and to be understood. Everyone in this world wants to be understood or he wants to understand people. This is the basic emotion of human beings, to understand and be understood. Yes, we can understand people, or for that matter, people can understand us only if we listen properly, only if we listen carefully. That's why the best way to understand people is to listen to them. We should listen people. That's why it's often said that man is born with 2 ears and one mouth. Why 2 ears? So that he or she may listen more and more. Why only one mouth? So that he or she speak less. It means that we should give priority to listening. But at the same time, don't. It doesn't mean that one need to be quiet. No. After listening, one need to give a suitable feedback or response. Then the cycle of communication will be complete. Therefore, the most basic of all human needs is to understand and be understood. It's the basic emotion of human being that he or she uh, should be understood or he or she should understand people. Yes, we can understand people, or people can understand us only if we are a good listener or effective listener. Now, the definition, the most technical definition of listening. What's this? Definition of listening. Now, here, listening is a process of receiving, interpreting, and reacting to the message received from the communication sender. Now, listening, it's a process, which means it is something that involves different steps. It's something that follows a certain procedure. That's why we call it a process. And what is the first step in this process? The first step in this process is receiving. Receiving, it's the first and the foremost step in listening process. While listening, our ears at first receive the sound signal, which we call receive. And after receiving these sound signals, our ears send these sound signals to our brain so that our brain can decode, decipher those sound signals or interpret those sound signals. That's why the second stage is interpreting, and the last one is reacting. After decoding, after deciphering, after understanding the sound signals, our brain gives a suitable feedback, which we call reacting or responding or feedback. Now, one need to understand that listening, it's not something that happen in a void all of sudden. No, it's a process that follows a certain procedure, that follows a certain norm. What is that norm? The first thing is that our ears, they receive these sound signals, which we call receiving. After receiving the sound signals, our ears, they transfer these sound signals to the brain so that brain can decode, decipher these sound signals. After decoding and deciphering of sound signals, our brain try to understand, try to interpret those sound signals. And in the last stage, our brain uh, gives a suitable feedback after understanding or after interpreting those sound signals. Now, listening, it involves recognizing the sounds of speech and processing them into words and sentences. Now, again, listening it involves recognizing of sound signals. In listening process, the listener at first tries to recognize the sound signals, tries to identify the sound signals. And after recognizing, after identifying the sound signals, our brain, it starts its process, or it starts its processing of those sound signals. And after processing these sound signals, we give our feedback in the form of words or in the form of sentences. The next one is it's an active, purposeful process of making sense of what we hear. It's an active process. That means here the listener, he takes cajoles to understand the sound signals. That's why we call it active process. Here the listener actively participate in this process. And at the same time, it's purposeful process. Why? When we listen something, we listen it with a purpose. And this purpose can be anything. For example, if a student listens in a class, or if a student listens carefully teacher's words, he listens it with a purpose. And the, that's why we call it purposeful process of making sense. Whatever we listen it with a purpose. We try to deduce a sense from that. We try to deduce or we try to extract sense from whatever we listen or whatever we hear. Now, the next, we often confuse listening with hearing when they are poles apart, when they are different. Listening is completely different from hearing. But we often confuse listening with hearing or vice versa. Here we will see the difference between hearing and listening in order to understand the listening or in order to understand listening skills. The first, hearing. Hearing, it's a physiological or physical activity, while as listening, it's an intellectual activity. Hearing, it's a mere physical activity or it's a mere physical exercise. Or you can say that this hearing, it's the first and the foremost step of a listening process. For example, when we hear a sound or when we hear words, here we do not in hearing, we do not try to decipher, try to decode sound signals. In fact, this hearing, it remains confined to the receiving of sound signals. That's why we call it a physical exercise or we call it the physiological activity. For example, our ears receive the sound signal. It's a mere physical activity, it's a mere physiological activity. But on the other hand, listening, it's an intellectual activity. How? For example, whenever ears receive sound signals, after that, our ears send these sound signals to the brain, and our brain tries to decode, decipher those sound signals. Here starts the intellectual activity. That's why we call it listening. It's an intellectual activity because here we not only hear the sound signals. In fact, here we try to decipher, decode those sound signals so as to give a feedback. That's why listening, it's an intellectual activity. And hearing, it remains confined to the one point, that is receiving of sound signals. Here we don't interpret, decode sound signals. Or in other words, you can say that the hearing is the first and the foremost step of listening skills. The second one is it's automatic process, while as listening is effortful process. Hearing, it's an automatic process. That means it's an involuntary process. For example, I'm sitting here, but at the same time, I'm hearing the sound produced by the fan. This is involuntary process. It's automatic process. I'm here, that's why I'm hearing the sound produced by the fan. I don't take any cajoles to understand these sound signals. I don't try to decipher, decode those sound signals produced by the fan. That's why it's called automatic process. While as listening, it's an effortful process. For example, when we listen our teachers, we listen each and every word with an effort so that we can decipher, decode those words produced by our teacher in order to understand the message, or in order to give a feedback. That's why listening is an effortful process. It takes effort on the part of a listener. Here, listener cautiously takes each and every word of the speaker so as to understand it, so as to decipher it, so as to give a feedback. That's why listening is an effortful process. Third, involuntarily act or the passive act. While as listening, it's a voluntarily act or active act. Hearing, it's an involuntary act. Here we take sound signals of its own. As I told you that, for example, right now I'm sitting here, but at the same time I am hearing the sound signals produced by the fan. I take these sound signals involuntarily, sometimes without being conscious of it. And the second point is, I don't take any cajole or pains to decipher these sound signals produced by the fan. On the other hand, listening is a voluntary act or active act. While listening, we listen every word or the sound signal with a with an intention, with a purposeful intention. We try to uh, decode the sound signals so that we can understand the meaning, so that we can understand the meaning of those sound signals, or so that we can give a very good feedback. That's why it's a voluntary act. For example, when a student listens his or her teacher, this act is a voluntary act. Why? Because here the student tries to understand the message of the teacher. Next one is hearing doesn't require coordination of ears and the brain. That's very important. In hearing, there is no coordination between ears and the brain. Hearing remains confined to the receiving of the sound signals. In hearing, our ears do not send these sound signals to the brain. There's no coordination in hearing, there's no coordination between ears and the brain. While as in listening, there's a coordination between ears and the brain. For example, if I'm a listener, if I'm a, yes, of course, if I'm a listener, I'm listening someone, or for that matter, I'm listening to my teacher. First, my ears will receive the sound signals pronounced by the teacher. Thereafter, My ears will send these sound signals to the brain so that brain can decode, decipher, or interpret those sound signals in order to understand the message of the teacher. That's why in listening there's a coordination between ears and the brain. The next one is hearing. In hearing, only receiving of sound signals. Hearing, it's all about receiving of sound signals and nothing else. That's why I told you that it's a physiological activity or physical activity. Receiving, on the other hand, receiving actually it's here in the in listening we receive thoughts, feelings, and opinions of it. In listening process, we take care of thoughts, feelings, or emotions or ideas of the speaker. We try to understand them. We try to decipher them. We try to understand them so that we can give our response. Next one, in hearing, no attention is paid to body language or paralanguage. In hearing process, we don't pay any attention to body language or paralanguage. For example, as I told you that this hearing, it's a mere physical exercise where our ears just receive the sound signals. Here, we do not pay any attention to body language of the speaker. For that matter, we don't pay attention to gesture, posture, facial expressions of the speaker. We just receive the sound signals. Or we don't pay attention to paralanguage. That is the rise and fall of sound, intonation, citrus marks. We don't pay any attention. Vocalics, what we call vocalics, we don't pay attention to the vocalics. We just receive the sound signal. And here in listening, attention is paid to body language as well as paralanguage. Here we take both things into consideration. That is body language and paralanguage. While listening, we take care of body language of the speaker. We try to trace the meaning of speaker's posture, gestures, facial expressions. Or for that matter, we take care of vocalics. That means the paralanguage. We see the intonation. We see the rise and fall of sound. We try to understand rise and fall of pitch of the sound or the volume of the speaker's words. The next one is no decoding is done. In hearing, we don't decode sound signals. We just receive the sound signals. On the other hand, in listening, what we do proper analysis and evaluation of those sound signals, which we call decoding or deciphering of sound signals. It was the difference between hearing and listening. We often take hearing for listening, which is a great fallacy in listening process. Hearing, it's different from listening. And the basic difference is that hearing, it's a mere physical exercise, while as listening, it's an intellectual exercise. Now, the next one is stage of listening process. As I told you that listening, it's a process. It's not something which happens in white or for that matter all of a sudden. It's a process. It follows a certain procedure. It follows a certain norm, or you can say that it follows certain steps. Here we will see these steps one by one. Our first step is receive. Receiving is the first and the foremost step in listening process. In receiving, our ears just to receive the sound signals. That's why we call it a mere physical exercise. And the second step is understanding. After receiving the sound signals, our ears send these sound signals to the brain so that our brain can decode these sound signals, decipher these sound signals, or try to interpret these sound signals, or try to understand these sound signals. That's why understanding is the second step of the listening process. Here in understanding, our brain tries to decode, decipher, or interpret these sound signals so as to understand its meaning, so as to understand its content, or so as to understand the message. Now, the next third step is remembering. After decoding, deciphering, or understanding these sound signals, our brain tries to retain these sound signals in the form of a message. Our brain tries to retain, our brain tries to store these sound signals in the form of a message, which we call remembering. And the next one is evaluating. After remembering, our brain try to evaluate this retained information or these retained sound signals, which we call evaluating. And after evaluation, we give a feedback. That means a response. These are the different stages of listening. That's why we call it a process. It's not something which happen in a white or all of a sudden. It follows certain procedures, certain norms, or certain steps. And what are these steps? The first is the receiving, second is the understanding, third one is the remembering, then we have the evaluating, and the last one is the feedback. Now, the next one is barriers of listening skills. There are many types of barriers to effective listening, and they can be classified as follows. First one is the linguistic barrier, then we have the physical barrier, then we have the psychological barrier, then we have the physiological barrier, cultural barrier, attitudinal barrier, making assumptions, information overload. These are the different barriers, and we will take these barriers of listening skill one by one. The first one is the psychological barrier. The word psychological means something that deals with our psyche or nerves. That's why we call it psychological barrier. Here, our listening may be affected by the psychological factors such as extreme emotions, excitement, anxiety, fear, feeling of superiority or inferiority, etc. These may prevent us from listening and understanding other persons. Now, the first one is the psychological. Psychological barrier, it involves factors like emotions, feelings, anxiety, fear. For example, when a person is too emotional, these emotions naturally affect his ability to listen. Or, for example, if a person is in great excitement, this excitement surely will become barrier in his listening process. Or for that matter, when a person is in anxiety or fear, this anxiety or fear will surely hinder his ability to listen effectively. That's why we call it the psychological barrier. It deals with the one psyche. And these may prevent us from listening and understanding the other person. When a person is in fear, surely this fear, it becomes a barrier. It becomes a barrier to listen properly. And when that person doesn't listen properly, it's natural he will not understand the speaker, he will not respond properly. Therefore, the first one is the psychological barrier, which deals with our mental or the emotional state. If a person is not in a good emotional state, or if a person is perturbed or disturbed by some emotions, surely these emotions will hinder his listening process. The second one is the physiological barrier, or you can say the physical barrier. Here, if a person suffers from injury, illness, or bodily stress, it can get in the way of their ability to hear and process what is being said. Now, the physiological barrier means it is something that relates to one's body. If psychological barrier deals with one's psyche or mind or emotions, this physiological barrier, it deals with one's body. If someone is physically deformed, if someone has some hearing problem, or if someone suffers from illness or some body injury or some body sickness, surely that person will not understand the message. Surely that person will not receive each and every sound signal pronounced by the speaker. That's why it's called a physiological barrier. It deals with our health, it deals with our body. It, for example, if someone is suffering from hearing problem, surely this hearing problem will hinder his listening process. He can't take the sound signals, he can't decode or decipher those sound signals, he can't interpret those sound signals, and ultimately he can't give a suitable feedback. Now, the next one is the cultural barrier. Cultural barrier, of course, this cultural barrier sometimes hinders our listening process. When two persons are from two different cultures, they face different barriers. For example, their accent doesn't vary. Their pronunciation of their accent surely vary, and their pronunciation of words is different. That's why this their culture and whatever they attained from this culture or whatever they inherited from this culture becomes hindrance in their listening process. For example, if you go in North India, they're the people for that matter, school is school. They pronounce is school. And in the South, you will find people pronounce that, for example, listening. Surely they have the different pronunciation, they have different accents, they have different, for that matter, intonations, they have different rise and fall of sounds. And this cultural difference, it becomes barrier in the listening process. Now, the next one is attitudinal barrier. Here, egocentrism, attitudinal barrier is related to one's ego. That's why I told you that in listening process, one should not be egocentric. One should negate self so that he or she can take each and every word pronounced by the speaker. Where the listener is biased with the thoughts, he or she is more knowledgeable than the speaker. In attitudinal barrier, the listener thinks that he or she is more knowledgeable than the speaker, therefore, there's no need to listen. Here, our attitude, here, our ego becomes a barrier in this listening process, becomes a barrier between ourselves and the speaker. That's why in the attitudinal barrier, we often consider that we are better than the speaker, or we know more than the speaker, or we are more knowledgeable than the speaker. Therefore, there is no need to listen. We call it attitudinal barriers. And then we have making assumptions. When we make assumptions about the speaker's intent or meaning before they have even finished their statement, we aren't practicing effective listening. Now, sometimes without listening to the speaker, we make certain assumptions. Like, for example, speaker is going to say this and this now. We assume things. We preconceive certain things. And this making assumption, hinders our listening process. It becomes a barrier in our listening process. That's why here the speaker, we assume that we know the speaker's intention, we know what speaker is going to say. Therefore, there's no need to listen. And this type of making assumption, it hinders or it destroys this process of listening. Then the next one is the information overload. It was coined by the political science professor Bertram Gross in his book The Management of Organization, which was published in 1964. What is this information overload? Information overload is when you have so much information coming at you. It's easy to become overwhelmed. It's a threshold beyond which your mind is unable to absorb any more data. And this term, information overload, it was made famous by Alvin Toffler in his famous or seminal book, Future Shock. This name of a book. Now, what's this information overload? When we receive too much information, or when too much information is coming to the listener, and the listener, he becomes so overwhelmed with this information that he fails to absorb or receive the more and more information. That's why it's a threshold beyond which your mind is unable to absorb any more in data. When there is a too much information, then when there is a too much flow of information, surely the listener reach to a stage where he or she is unable to receive further information. That's why we call it information overload. Okay, these are the different references which you can consult for further reading. Here, it was all about the listening skill. What's listening? Well, here we discussed about the listening process, different stage of listening, how listening is different from hearing, and what are the different listening barriers. It was all about this lecture. Hope you will have understood all this. We will meet in next video with next topic. Till then, goodbye. Thank you and goodbye.
Like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.